We're here to talk about the missing middle. So why does it exist, right? I'll define what it is in a bit, but why is there a gap in capital for these companies that are trying to solve these problems? The answer to that actually sits in this book, which is strange because this is a book on the history of science. Nothing to do with business, nothing to do with impact. It's a book that my wife put in her dissertation. It's cited in her dissertation. She's a philosopher of science, but a philosopher. Now, when I do this in person and I ask the room, I got 100 people in the room and I say, who's ever even heard of this book? Usually 1 or 2 hands pop up. But everyone here knows what's in this book because this is the book that defined the word paradigm, right? The idea that we talk about, the layman term paradigm, right? You're stuck in a paradigm. We need a paradigm shift and so forth. It's defined in this book. This is a book from like 1965, 66, 67. And again, it's describing the history of science and how science works. But the same thing applies to business. The same thing applies to nonprofits. The same thing applies to government. Here's what a paradigm is, according to Kuhn. A paradigm is a set of beliefs that you use to filter the evidence, the news that comes into your life. And then when you see this news and it doesn't fit your paradigm, what you do is you ignore it, which doesn't sound right. It sounds like what these scientists are supposed to see the new evidence and adopt it, but that's not what actually happens in science. What happens is they have a belief. Let's just take a simple belief, like the Earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around it. That was the truth, right? That was what all the big thinkers believed until about 1600 and something. And despite the evidence that came in that said, wait, no, these orbits of the planets don't make any sense. And, the tides don't make any sense and so forth. All that evidence was just ignored until there was so much evidence, until Copernicus and Galileo had so much evidence, it had to be something else. And then there's a shift and there's a new set of beliefs. And it's hard to get away from those beliefs and so forth. So the ultimate problem of the missing middle is that we are stuck in a paradigm. We're stuck in a paradigm, and most people who are in it don't even understand that they're in it. They just assume that that's just how you do things, and they just assume that it had been done forever that way, and there's no other solution. And they continue to make the mistakes of the past because they just don't see where the edges of this paradigm are. They're just ignoring all the evidence. So it started. Here's the paradigm. Started with a guy named Georges Dureau. You probably never heard of him. This is the first venture capitalist in the modern style. Born in France, moved to the United States after World War I to make a better life. Helped run the World War II for the United States. What he's best known for is not actually being a venture capitalist. What he's best known for is that he was an administrator at a new school back in the 40s called Harvard Business School. Harvard College is, of course, 400 years old, but Harvard Business School is not. Harvard Business School got created in the 1940s. He wasn't a teacher. He taught. He was the most beloved professor of his time, but he actually didn't have the qualifications to be a professor. He was an administrator, and he had a big following. Right? Again, the most popular class there was at the time, which was just called management. The other thing he did while he was administering the school and teaching and running some companies, he also started this thing called American Research and Development. It was the first venture capital company. It wasn't a fund. Funds came a little bit later. It was the first venture capital-like thing that existed. It started in 1946, just after the war. Their annual report looked like in 1953. Wasn't that thick. That's a mock-up, but that's the actual cover of the guide. It invested in all sorts of things. The paradigm didn't start with just software companies, not in 1953 or 46. Clearly, we didn't have computers back then. But the big win for this investment company was digital equipment, which, if you've not heard of it, was the second largest computer company in the country, in the world, in the 60s. American Research and Development owned the majority of it and made an immense sum of money. Okay, but anyway, we're not here to talk about tech. We're here to talk about the missing middle. So first, you have to understand the paradigm that everyone's stuck in. And the paradigm comes all the way back from 46. And it looks like this. So if we sat down with a California venture capitalist and we asked them, what are you looking for? They'll tell you, I'm looking for multi-billion dollar opportunities. I'm looking for business models that can grow really fast, 2-3 times year over year over year. I need the companies to be 10x bigger in 5 years, and then 10x bigger again. 10x shows up a lot in their conversations. And then, of course, I need a great team to execute. In fact, when you sit down and ask them, they even skip the first two, and they'll just say that what I look for most of all is a great team. And you say, well, what else do you look for? And they go, well, it's really team, team, team. They themselves don't really talk about 1 and 2, but they're there. I've pushed them and I've asked them, and they'll admit 1 and 2 are there before you get to team. But there are 2 more things in their paradigm they don't talk about. The fourth one is that they're a business. So funds exist now, not AR&D, but all the funds subsequent to that. They're designed to make 15 to 20 investments, right? Or they're going to invest in 15 to 20 companies, to be more specific. But what that means is they have to actually put to use, burn, like put out there 1/20th of the money in the fund to each of the 20 companies. Some of them will be a little bit bigger and some will be a little smaller, but they have to put the money to work. That's how they make money. They make money by using the money. So they have to find business plans that need large sums of money, because venture capital funds are hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars now. And so they have to find big deals that can burn a lot of money. And they don't worry about how fast companies burn money. As long as there's a high growth model, they're happy burning the money because they have to. And then the other one that they don't talk about, not openly and proudly, but their whole model is wrapped around these companies getting acquired. A few of them go IPO, a few of them go public. It's really rare. It's used to happen more often. It's exceedingly rare now. Nearly every company that has an exit, is what they call it, will be acquired by another company in 7 to 10 years. That's getting longer and longer over time. 20 years ago, that was 5 to 7 years. 30 years ago, that was 3 to 5 years. It's probably really 12 to 15 years now. Okay, that is the paradigm. That is what they're doing. And then if you sit down with an African VC or an Indian VC, I've talked to them as well, and you ask them what their model is, they're going to regurgitate the same thing. And I'm going to ask them, if I'm there, great, who's buying the companies? The way we phrase this is, how many exits are there? So how many exits were there in Africa in 2021? Fewer than a handful. How many in India? Maybe 2 handfuls. How many in the US? A few hundred. There are very, very few. So if there aren't any acquirers, the whole model falls apart, because that's the only way the VCs get their money back out. So then the next question to ask as you dig down into this paradigm, to break the paradigms, you have to question them. And the next question you ask is, well, okay, in the US, where this is working in some cities, doesn't work everywhere, but let's just say in San Francisco or in New York or in Boston, who are the actual companies that are acquiring these VC-backed companies? And the surprising thing you find, at least surprising because we don't talk about this much, is that the acquirers tend to be companies that got funded by VCs 1 or 2 generations ago. So in the 90s, one of the companies doing a lot of acquisitions was Intel, which was a VC-backed company from the 60s. And in the noughts, Cisco was doing a lot of acquisitions. And Cisco was a VC-backed company from the 80s and early 90s. Microsoft has done a ton of acquisitions, hundreds and hundreds of companies. And they were slightly VC-backed. They're a slightly different path, but they're in that same space. And they were a public company in the mid-80s. And then, of course, Google. I don't know. Google's probably bought thousands of companies, mostly for their people, not even for their products. And Google was, of course, funded by VCs in the very late 90s. I think it was before the dot-com bubble. Point is that the cycle of acquisitions in the venture capital world is funded by the venture capital world. That if you want to have a thriving VC ecosystem wherever you are, whether that's New Delhi or Kinshasa, well, it's going to take a long time, because the companies that are going to acquire the current crop of venture-backed companies are the ones you're funding right now. And it's going to take you 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years to get this cycle going, if it ever gets going. That is one cause of the missing middle, is we don't have that cycle. All right, so a few more things on the background here. So when was the first actual venture capital fund? We know what it was. It's not that long ago. It was 1961. It was Davis and Rock. Here's pictures of them. I think they're still alive. Like, we're not talking about something that happened in the last century. We're talking about something that happened just before I was born, 50 something years ago. And it happened in California, of all places, right? We talk about, we think of venture capital as something that happens in Silicon Valley, and it does. And this company, this fund, was from Silicon Valley. It really started there. They funded two of the huge names of Silicon Valley. They funded Fairchild and Intel in the 60s. This didn't work for them. Like, for whatever reason, the team broke up. Arthur Rock, though, turned out to write a check to a little company in Silicon Valley called Apple. He was an angel for Apple. And Davis, there's a typo there. Davis was the founder of Mayfield, which is still one of the top 5 VC funds in the world. I don't think he still works there, but he was the founder, and his fund still exists. And this was a 10-year, 2 and 20, all the normal things we're used to in seeing a fund. It was there in 1961. And the next one after that, and they were both students of Duro in HBS. That was the connection. So they learned about it from their mentor. And then same thing kind of happened in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Boston, basically. A few years later, Greylock got started. So it was basically looking at the graduates of MIT and Harvard and the tech community that was built up around Boston. The 4 people who founded Greylock worked at AMR&D. They worked at American Research and Development with Duro. So he taught them as well. And they funded a few things that you've heard of and a few you haven't, but they funded Facebook and LinkedIn. Like, this is where the VC money came from. And it dates back to 65, not the same fund that got started in 65, whatever we are now, the 10th fund or the 15th fund or the 20th fund, but it's still going on in the same style. They moved out of Boston in 2009. They're now a California VC as well. And just to drive home how recent this is, or what era we're talking about. So venture capital, as we see it today, is the same age as the Beatles, right? Which may seem old to a lot of you people out there. But it's not. It's my parents were teenagers or early 20s when the Beatles were doing this. It's the same basic age as the era of decolonization. So Kenya is older than Greylock, and Kenya's 2 years younger than the first VC fund. But it's in that same realm of time. And Kenya was one of the earliest in Africa to gain independence.